In the bustling dining room of one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, Lila, a black waitress in her early 30s, navigated between tables with a grace and professionalism that made her stand out among the staff. The restaurant, known for its fine cuisine and exclusive clientele, was a place where every meal felt like an event, where money and power were on display in every corner, and where people came to feel important, even if only for a night. For Lila, who had worked there for 5 years, it wasn't just about serving food, it was about creating an experience, one that spoke to her passion and dedication. Yet, despite her expertise and poise, Lila had learned the hard way that her professionalism was often met with little more than indifference or, worse, disrespect. On a particular evening, as the restaurant buzzed with energy, a well-known billionaire, Charles Grayson, entered the dining room with his entourage, his presence immediately filling the space. He was a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, and his arrogance was palpable, evident in the way he walked and the way he dismissed anyone who seemed beneath him. Lila had seen him before, a regular among the city's elite, and while she had always remained courteous, she'd never been particularly fond of his entitled air. Still, she did her job, keeping her personal feelings in check and focusing on the task at hand. The night began smoothly, with Lila taking his drink order and attending to his table with a smile, as she did with every other guest. However, as the evening wore on, Charles's behavior became increasingly erratic. His voice grew louder, and his demands more unreasonable. At one point, he insisted that the wine he had ordered was not to his liking, despite it being the same bottle he had chosen every time he visited. Lila, ever the professional, calmly apologized and promised to bring him a new selection, despite knowing full well that the wine was not the problem, his mood was. She could feel the eyes of the other guests on her as she moved swiftly to resolve the issue, doing everything she could to maintain the high standards expected of her. But when she returned with the new bottle, the billionaire was already irritated, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "This is unacceptable," he snapped, his voice laced with condescension. "I pay for the best, and I expect nothing less." Lila, standing before him, did her best to stay composed, fighting the sting of his words that echoed with an unspoken judgment. She wasn't just a waitress in his eyes, she was someone he could dismiss, someone whose worth was measured solely by her ability to serve. But Lila had learned early on that her worth was never defined by the people who saw her as invisible. She had faced worse. Her life, a series of small struggles woven together by determination, had taught her the value of resilience. "I apologize, sir," she said, keeping her voice steady, her hands poised with professional grace, despite the knot of tension in her chest. "If there's anything else I can do to make your experience better, please let me know." The billionaire scoffed, his face contorting in anger, and as if on cue, he stood up abruptly, causing the rest of the room to fall into an uneasy silence. He pointed an accusing finger at Lila, berating her in front of everyone. "You people think you can get away with this kind of service," he sneered, his voice sharp. "I don't care if you're the best in the restaurant, you're nothing but a waitress. Do you even know who I am?" The words were venomous, designed to wound, and Lila felt every syllable sink into her. She had been humiliated before, but this felt different. This was more than an insult to her job, it was an insult to her humanity. She could feel the heat rise in her chest, the urge to lash out, to defend herself, to make him see the person behind the uniform. But she didn't. In that moment, Lila made a choice. She took a slow, deliberate breath, refusing to let him win. Her pride and dignity, which he had tried to strip away, remained intact. Instead of allowing herself to crumble under the weight of his words, she met his gaze with unwavering calm. "I am here to ensure you have the best experience possible, sir," she replied, her voice a quiet strength that cut through his fury. "But no matter what you think of me, I will not let you speak to me in a way that diminishes my value as a person." The room was silent, and for the first time, Charles Grayson faltered. There was no response, no comeback. Just a stunned silence that hung in the air between them. Lila stood her ground, her composure never wavering, and though the billionaire eventually stormed off with his entourage, his anger unresolved, there was something in the way he left that was different. It wasn't just that he had lost a battle he didn't know he had entered. It was that, for the first time, he had met a person who refused to be belittled, no matter how much power or wealth he wielded. As Lila returned to her duties, a wave of emotion washed over her, but it was not defeat. It was pride. The incident did not make her bitter, but stronger. She knew she had stood up for herself without sacrificing the professionalism that had always defined her. She had faced his wrath and walked away unbroken, her dignity intact. The night had been a reminder that true strength lies not in the battles you win, but in the courage to remain true to yourself in the face of adversity. And though the world would continue to see her as just a waitress, Lila knew that in that moment, she had proven to herself and perhaps even to Charles Grayson that her worth was not defined by her job title or the opinions of others. Olivia Jenkins had always been a quiet woman, working as a waitress in a bustling cafe downtown, scraping by just enough to make ends meet. Her days were spent serving the city's elite, their arrogance and entitlement palpable as they sat at their tables, talking down to her and the other staff with dismissive glances and condescending words. Yet, Olivia never complained. She simply carried out her duties with grace, giving the best service she could, even as she dreamt of a life that was far beyond the small, crowded cafe and the constant hum of rich men and women who seemed to believe their wealth gave them the right to treat others like mere objects. Among her regulars was Alexander Blackwood, a ruthless billionaire whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance. He owned a vast real estate empire, always dressed in the finest suits, and always with the cold, calculating demeanor of someone who had long stopped caring about the people who made his life possible. Olivia had encountered him countless times, always polite but never going beyond the boundaries of professional courtesy. Yet, despite the way he ignored her, treating her like a shadow, she noticed things that most people didn't. She noticed the way he made deals at the expense of others, how his ruthless business practices often led to people losing their homes and livelihoods. She knew that his success had come at the cost of others' suffering, but she had always kept her thoughts to herself, understanding that in her world, her voice didn't matter. Until the day Alexander crossed a line. It was an ordinary morning when he walked into the cafe with his usual air of superiority, demanding the best seat by the window. Olivia, who was waiting on his table, overheard a conversation he was having on the phone. He was discussing a multi-billion-dollar development project that was about to go through, and Olivia's heart sank as she listened. He was boasting about how he had leveraged the misfortune of struggling homeowners to secure the project, how he had bullied city officials into approving it, and how, once completed, he would make a fortune while forcing families out of their homes. The weight of his words hit her like a punch in the gut. She had always known that his wealth was built on the backs of others, but hearing it so plainly, hearing the pride in his voice as he described ruining lives for personal gain, broke something inside her. Olivia's fingers tightened around her tray as she walked up to his table, her mind racing with anger and disbelief. She had served him countless times before, always with a smile, always with respect, but now, She felt something inside her stir, a deep, burning need to stand up, to say something, anything, to show him that he wasn't above the people he had so carelessly crushed. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "I don't know how you can sit there and smile, knowing that people are going to lose everything because of you." The words came out before she could stop them, the rage and frustration she had bottled up for years spilling out in that one moment. Alexander looked up at her, his expression blank for a moment before a smirk curled at the corner of his lips. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Are you implying that I should feel sorry for the people who've failed in business? People like them don't deserve to hold on to what they've got." The dismissive cruelty in his words shocked her, but Olivia refused to back down. "You're ruining lives," she said, her voice growing stronger, "and you don't even care. You sit there, making billions while families are going to be forced onto the streets. And you don't even see them as people. You see them as numbers on a ledger." There was a long pause, and for a moment, the cafe seemed to quiet. The patrons at nearby tables were watching now, their eyes flicking back and forth between Alexander and Olivia. She could feel the tension building in the air, the weight of her challenge to the powerful billionaire. For the first time, she felt like her voice mattered. "You're not the only one who's worked hard for something," Olivia continued, her voice now unwavering. "Some of us work twice as hard, just to survive. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend that you're some kind of hero for doing it at the expense of others." Alexander's face darkened, his pride stung by her words. But before he could respond, something shifted in the room. The other customers, who had been quietly listening, began to murmur among themselves. Word spread quickly through the cafe, and soon, the employees, who had always treated Olivia with a mix of respect and silent admiration, began to take notice of her bold stand. A few customers, seeing the injustice in the way Alexander was behaving, started to speak out as well. The room became charged with a new energy, and for the first time, Alexander's wealth and power seemed irrelevant in the face of Olivia's courage. The next day, the story of Olivia's confrontation with the billionaire went viral. News outlets picked it up, and soon the hashtag boycott Blackwood was trending. People across the country rallied against the unethical practices of Alexander Blackwood's empire. The pressure was immense, and just days later, Alexander found himself at the center of a public relations nightmare. His business was hit with backlash, and legal challenges soon followed. His multi-billion-dollar development project, once a sure thing, was halted by protests and court orders. Olivia's quiet act of rebellion, her refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice, had done what no lawyer, no protest, and no amount of money could do. She had exposed the truth about Alexander's empire and forced him to confront the consequences of his actions. Within months, his wealth shrank by billions, his reputation shattered, and his influence in the business world diminished. Olivia's stand, fueled by the voices of the many who had suffered at Alexander's expense, had taken down a titan. It wasn't just about a waitress standing up to a billionaire, it was a testament to the power of one person, one voice, to make a difference in a world that often seems stacked against the powerless. Lucas Bennett was a man who had it all, or so it seemed. As the CEO of a thriving tech company, his life was filled with meetings, deadlines, and constant pressure to stay on top. Money was never an issue, and his days were consumed by success, efficiency, and the relentless pursuit of more. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Lucas was deeply lonely. His personal life was a blur of forgotten birthdays, empty dinner tables, and a gnawing emptiness that no business deal, no amount of money, could fill. The more he succeeded, the more isolated he became. One evening, feeling especially drained after another grueling day, Lucas decided to take a break from his high-profile world and seek solace in the quiet of a modest diner he had passed countless times but never entered. It was the kind of place where regulars gathered over mugs of coffee, where the air was thick with the scent of fresh bread and the chatter of everyday life. As he stepped inside, he felt almost out of place. The noise of the bustling kitchen, the clink of silverware, and the warm smiles of waitstaff felt foreign to him, yet oddly comforting in their simplicity. He was led to a booth by a waitress named Sarah, whose welcoming smile softened the sharpness of his usual cold demeanor. She didn't treat him like the powerful businessman he was, she didn't ask for his autograph or try to engage him in a superficial conversation. Instead, she simply took his order, asked if he wanted anything else, and left him to his thoughts. Lucas was struck by how normal it all felt. For the first time in months, he wasn't measured by his wealth or status, he was just another person, sitting in a diner, having a meal. Sarah returned a few minutes later with his food, her calm presence a stark contrast to the whirlwind of his daily life. Lucas barely noticed her at first, his mind preoccupied with the endless tasks waiting for him once he returned to his office. But then, just as he was about to take a bite, Sarah placed a small napkin beside his plate. It was folded neatly, and written on it in delicate handwriting was a single phrase, "You're not invisible." At first, Lucas thought it was a mistake, or perhaps just a random message left by the waitress. He scanned the room to see if anyone else was watching, but there was no one. It was as if the message had been meant solely for him. He felt an unexpected lump form in his throat as the weight of the words settled in. The line was simple, yet profound. "You're not invisible." In the years of climbing the corporate ladder, Lucas had forgotten what it was like to be seen as a person rather than a name on a boardroom table. He had become so consumed with proving himself, with building his empire, that he had isolated himself from the world around him. To most people, he was just a shadow, a figure whose face was known, but whose heart and soul had long been buried beneath the layers of success. But here, in the quiet hum of this unassuming diner, a waitress who had never heard of him had reminded him of something vital: he existed beyond the numbers, beyond the transactions, beyond the power plays. He was a human being, and he mattered. The simple act of writing those words had ignited something inside him, a spark of realization that he had long since buried. He realized that his relentless pursuit of success had come at the cost of everything that truly mattered: genuine connection, love, and kindness. He wasn't just a CEO, a figurehead of an empire, he was a man who needed to be seen, who needed to be acknowledged. It wasn't just the food or the service that had made this moment different, it was Sarah's quiet, compassionate action, her refusal to treat him as just another customer, that had made the impact. Lucas sat in that booth for what felt like hours, reflecting on his life. He thought about his estranged family, his long-lost friends, and the hollow relationships he had cultivated in the pursuit of power. The more he thought, the more he realized that what he had been missing wasn't more success or wealth, it was connection. That night, Lucas made a promise to himself that he would change. He would stop hiding behind the facade of achievement and start focusing on the relationships that truly mattered. He would make time for the people he had neglected, open himself up to the vulnerability that he had long feared, and begin to rebuild the life that he had unintentionally lost. The next day, Lucas returned to the diner. He didn't need to explain why Sarah had already made her impact. But when she saw him walk in, she smiled, and he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for that simple, yet powerful, gesture. Lucas didn't just leave her a tip that day, he left her a note, one that mirrored the words she had written for him. "You're not invisible, either." In that small, humble diner, the walls Lucas had spent years building around his heart began to crumble. And though he couldn't explain it fully, he knew that Sarah's quiet act of kindness had altered the course of his life. It was a reminder that, in the end, what really matters is not how much we achieve, but how we see each other, how we acknowledge one another's humanity. In a world that often feels too fast, too driven, and too impersonal, it only takes one silent action to remind someone that they are, indeed, seen. In the gleaming skyscrapers of the city, where deals were struck in boardrooms and power was measured by numbers, there was a billionaire CEO named Richard Hayes who had everything a man could want: wealth, influence, and a reputation that stretched far beyond the corporate world. Yet, for all his success, Richard had a tendency to overlook the people he deemed beneath him: the waitstaff at his favorite restaurant, the drivers who chauffeured him, and the janitors who cleaned his office spaces. To him, they were simply invisible, mere cogs in the wheel of his empire, to be dismissed or disregarded at will. One afternoon, as Richard sat at a corner table in an upscale restaurant for a lunch meeting with a potential investor, he was served by a young waitress named Maya, who, with her humble demeanor and kind smile, went about her duties with grace and efficiency. She was a new hire, eager to make a good impression, but the weight of her responsibilities as a single mother of two, working long hours to make ends meet, never left her mind. As Maya approached Richard's table to take his order, she could feel the pressure of the moment. She had heard about him from the other staff. His reputation preceded him. He was known to be impatient, demanding, and dismissive, and she could already sense his gaze narrowing as she arrived at his table. Her nerves fluttered in her chest, but she pushed them down, focusing on her work. She greeted him politely, but as she began to take his order, Richard, distracted and annoyed, cut her off with an imperious tone. "You're new, aren't you?" he sneered, eyeing her uniform with a glance that made her feel small. Maya nodded, trying to remain calm. "Yes, sir. I'm Maya, and I'll be happy to take your order." "I'll have the lobster bisque and the filet mignon," he said dismissively, looking past her as if she weren't even there. "And get me a bottle of your finest wine. Don't waste my time with anything cheap." Maya, doing her best to suppress the rising discomfort in her chest, nodded again and turned to leave. But as she walked away, Richard called out in a sharp tone, "And don't take so long. I have a meeting to get to." His words stung more than she cared to admit, but she refused to let them show. As she made her way back to the kitchen, Maya felt a knot of frustration twist in her stomach. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to be made to feel small by someone like him. She was no stranger to tough situations, but the arrogance in his voice, his complete disregard for her as a person, felt like a slap to her dignity. Despite her feelings, Maya did her best to prepare the meal quickly, knowing that time was always of the essence when serving someone like Richard. However, when she returned with his order, she made a small mistake. She accidentally spilled a drop of soup on the corner of his expensive suit while setting down the lobster bisque. It was a simple accident, but for Richard, it was a humiliation. His face turned red with anger, and without thinking, he lashed out. "How careless can you be?" he shouted, his voice booming in the quiet restaurant. "I don't know how you people manage to get through the day without ruining everything." The sudden outburst drew the attention of nearby diners, and Maya's face burned with embarrassment. She wanted to apologize, to explain that it was an accident, but before she could utter a word, Richard stood up, towering over her, his eyes cold and furious. "I'll have you fired for this." Don't you dare think you can get away with this level of incompetence. The words sliced through Maya, leaving her speechless. For a moment, she stood frozen, the weight of his cruelty pressing down on her chest, but then something inside her snapped. She had endured enough in her life, enough judgment, enough scorn, enough people telling her she wasn't good enough. She wasn't going to take this from him. With a trembling but steady voice, she finally spoke. "I'm sorry for spilling the soup, sir," she said, meeting his eyes. "But you have no right to speak to me like that. I'm here working hard to support my family, just like you work hard for yours. I may be a waitress, but I'm a person, and I deserve to be treated with respect." The room seemed to fall silent as Richard's face flickered between surprise and rage. For a moment, he opened his mouth to retort, but something in Maya's calm, steady gaze stopped him. The realization hit him harder than he cared to admit: he had crossed a line. He had belittled a woman who was simply doing her best, just as he did every day. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he sneered, turned on his heel, and left the restaurant, ignoring the apology she offered him in a last attempt to salvage the moment. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur for Maya, the sting of Richard's words still echoing in her mind, but she refused to let them define her. She finished her shift, knowing that she had done nothing wrong. It wasn't until the following day that the unexpected consequence of Richard's outburst hit him like a wave. The investor he had been meeting with had been seated at a table across the room, and when he witnessed Richard's treatment of Maya, he was disgusted. That very evening, the investor withdrew from the deal, citing Richard's lack of integrity and his mistreatment of others as a key factor. The deal that Richard had spent months working on, one that could have brought him millions, slipped through his fingers, all because of a single moment of arrogance. The fallout from that loss was swift and devastating. In the following weeks, Richard's reputation began to sour as word spread about his behavior in the restaurant. Articles were written, and the media pounced on his arrogance, portraying him as the epitome of the entitled elite. Meanwhile, Maya, who had stood her ground and refused to let herself be humiliated, found her own quiet strength. Her courage, her refusal to be disrespected, resonated with many, and her story was shared by those who recognized her resilience. In the end, Richard lost far more than just a deal. He lost the respect of those around him. Maya, on the other hand, gained something priceless: a renewed sense of self-worth, the knowledge that no matter how small or invisible one might seem, standing up for oneself could change everything. Maria had worked at the same diner for years, her days a steady rhythm of refilling coffee cups, delivering meals, and offering a kind smile to every customer who walked through the door. She had learned to navigate the sometimes hostile world of service with grace, to wear her uniform with dignity despite the long hours and low pay. But what set Maria apart wasn't just her efficiency or her unwavering dedication, it was her resilience in the face of disrespect, a quiet strength that carried her through even the toughest moments. It was on one particularly busy afternoon, when the diner was packed with hungry patrons, that Maria's calm demeanor would be tested in a way she never expected. A man, well-dressed and clearly accustomed to luxury, sat down at the counter. From the moment he entered, there was a coldness about him, a sense of entitlement that radiated from his every movement. He looked around with a dismissive glance, as if he found the quaint diner beneath him a mere stop on his way to something far more important. Maria, as always, approached him with her usual warmth, offering a smile that was as genuine as it was professional. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her voice polite but steady, her hands resting on the counter, ready to take his order. The man didn't even look up from his phone as he glanced over the menu. "I'll have a coffee, Black, he said, still scrolling through his screen as if she were invisible. Maria nodded, turning to walk away, but before she could take more than a few steps, the man spoke again, his voice cutting through the hum of the diner. "And hurry it up," he added, his tone dripping with condescension. Maria paused, her hand tightening around the edge of the counter. The words stung, but she didn't let them show. She simply nodded again, turned, and made her way to the coffee station. As she poured his drink, she could feel his eyes on her, a silent judgment in the air that made her skin prickle. She had been on the receiving end of this type of treatment many times before, patrons who saw her as nothing more than a server, someone to be ignored or spoken down to, their impatience acting as a form of power. But Maria knew better than to let that power take root inside her. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, one forged through years of working jobs that asked for more than what was given in return, yet demanded even more resilience. When she returned with the coffee, she placed the cup in front of him without a word, her expression unchanged. The man barely acknowledged her presence, his eyes still glued to his phone as he swirled the spoon in his coffee absent-mindedly. He took a sip, then without warning, he looked up at her with an exaggerated frown. "This is cold," he said, his voice louder now, attracting the attention of a few nearby customers. Maria didn't flinch. She took a slow breath, meeting his eyes with a calmness that surprised even herself. "I'll be happy to get you a fresh cup, sir," she said, her voice unwavering, "but it will be a moment, as I'm quite busy." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't let her emotions cloud her response. Instead, she gave him the space to speak again if he wished, but she also made it clear that she would not be cowed by his behavior. The man's expression tightened, but before he could say anything further, a young woman sitting nearby, who had been watching the exchange, stood up and walked over to the counter. "I'm sorry, but I think you owe this woman an apology," the woman said, her voice firm but kind, addressing the man directly. "She's doing her job, and she's been nothing but polite to you." The man looked at her, clearly taken aback by the unexpected intervention. He opened his mouth to argue, but the woman continued. "You don't get to treat people like that just because you're having a bad day," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You don't get to make someone feel small just because you feel important." The man opened and closed his mouth, his arrogance crumbling in the face of her words. He looked back at Maria, then back at the woman, his face flushing a deep red. Maria, still standing there, had heard every word. She didn't need an apology from him. Her strength had always been in her ability to move forward with dignity, regardless of how others treated her. But the moment had shifted something inside her, a spark of solidarity that reminded her she wasn't alone, that the strength she carried was shared by those who chose to stand up, even when it wasn't their fight. The man muttered something under his breath, his face contorted in embarrassment. He placed some money on the counter and stood up, leaving without another word. The diner returned to its usual hum, the tension dissipating, but for Maria, the moment lingered. She hadn't just endured disrespect, she had stood her ground, her quiet strength undeniable. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a woman who knew her worth, who understood that her dignity was not up for negotiation. And in that moment, her strength didn't just come from her ability to tolerate disrespect, it came from her refusal to let it define her. As she returned to her work, Maria didn't need any applause or recognition. The woman who had stood up for her had already left, and the man who had disrespected her was gone. But the memory of the exchange stayed with her. In a world that often sought to belittle people like her, she had learned that her strength was enough. It was more than enough. Ethan Westbrook, the CEO of a billion-dollar tech empire, had built his entire life around success. Every aspect of his existence was carefully calculated: his tailored suits, his luxury car, the penthouse overlooking the city, symbols of his wealth and power. He was a man who had everything, yet remained impossibly distant from the world around him. People were tools to him, whether they were employees or clients, and empathy was something he had long abandoned in favor of the cold efficiency that had brought him to the top. He had never needed anyone, and he certainly didn't need anyone telling him what was important. That was, until one rainy evening, when he walked into a small, inconspicuous diner on the edge of town. The kind of diner people like him would never typically enter, but tonight, he needed a break from the fast-paced, high-stakes world he had created. The moment Ethan stepped through the door, the soft hum of conversation and clinking silverware felt like a world away from his usual realm of sharp meetings and flashing stock tickers. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and grilled bacon filled the air, an entirely different kind of warmth than the cold, sterile environment of his office. He sat at a corner booth, intent on eating quickly and leaving, not looking to engage with anyone or make small talk. His waitress, Emma, was in her late 20s, with long brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and an apron worn from years of service. Unlike the polished professionals he was used to, she wore no pretense. She greeted him with a warm smile, her eyes not judging but genuinely kind, the kind of smile that disarmed him instantly. "What can I get for you tonight?" she asked, her tone light but not intrusive. Ethan was caught off guard by her warmth. He ordered hastily, scanning the menu without truly looking. As she took his order, she asked, "How's your day been? Everything going okay?" He stared at her for a moment, surprised by the question. People in his world rarely asked how he was. It was always about what he could do for them, or how they could benefit from his success. "Fine," he muttered, a dismissive gesture as he sank into the corner of the booth. She gave him a knowing smile, as if she could see through his facade. As she walked away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. It wasn't long before his meal arrived, simple, unpretentious, but unexpectedly comforting. Emma placed the plate before him with a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose in her actions that caught his attention again. For a few moments, Ethan focused on the food, but as he took a bite, he couldn't help but notice her moving around the diner with ease, chatting with regulars, offering kind words to everyone, regardless of who they were. She wasn't just doing her job, she was genuinely connecting with people. The longer he sat there, the more his mind wandered, trying to process the unease he felt. In his world, power and status were the most important currencies. He prided himself on his ability to outsmart, outmaneuver, and dominate, but here, in this humble diner, Emma seemed to possess something he had long since forgotten: true connection. People came and went, but she treated everyone the same, as if each person mattered equally. No one was beneath her, and no one was too important for her to connect with. Ethan, however, was so wrapped up in his success that he had forgotten what it meant to be seen as a person, not just a symbol of wealth or achievement. Halfway through his meal, Emma returned to check on him. "How's everything?" she asked, her tone light and easy. This time, he met her gaze fully, his eyes searching hers. "It's good," he replied, his voice quieter, more contemplative than he had intended. She smiled again, her gaze steady and kind. "I'm glad," she said, before adding, "You know, I've found that sometimes, even when things seem perfect on the outside, people are still carrying a lot of weight. Just be sure to check in with yourself every now and then." Her words, simple and unassuming, hit him harder than any business deal or conference call had ever done. He had spent his life chasing success, yet it had left him isolated, his relationships transactional at best, shallow at worst. The realization hit him with an unexpected intensity. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't been able to feel in a long time: vulnerability. Emma's words echoed in his mind long after she left to attend to the other customers. He had spent decades building his empire, but he had done so at the expense of everything that truly mattered: authentic human connection, empathy, and understanding. By the time he finished his meal, the man who walked out of that diner was not the same one who had entered. As Ethan paid the bill, he asked for Emma to come over one last time. She approached with her usual calm, ready to see him off. He looked up at her, a soft smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now, genuine. "I didn't expect this, but it was exactly what I needed." Emma smiled, not as someone trying to win his approval, but as someone who understood that sometimes, the greatest moments of change come from the simplest of encounters. "You're welcome," she said, before turning to leave, her presence somehow leaving a lasting impact on Ethan. He walked out of the diner that night a different man, realizing that success wasn't measured by how much money or power one amassed, but by the relationships one cultivated, the lives one touched, and the way one chose to live with humility and authenticity. That night, a waitress had shown him the value of being human again, and in doing so, had changed the course of his life forever. Sophie Matthews had always prided herself on being a steady presence, someone who remained composed no matter how difficult her day might be. She had been working as a waitress at a small, family-owned diner for over 5 years, a job she had taken after a series of setbacks: lost opportunities, financial struggles, and the painful reality of being a single mother. The diner wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the regulars were kind. It was her haven in a world that often felt unpredictable, a place where she had learned to hold her head high despite the hardships life had thrown her way. But nothing could have prepared her for the day when a billionaire named Charles Harrington walked through the door. Tall, imposing, and dressed in a sharp suit, Charles was a man used to being treated with deference, a successful businessman who had built his fortune in real estate. His wealth gave him power, and he carried that power like an invisible weight, treating those around him with the cool detachment of someone who had never had to work a day for anything. Sophie had seen people like him before, the type who believed their status gave them the right to behave as if others existed solely to serve them. So when Charles entered the diner, his presence immediately shifted the air in the room, drawing stares from everyone, from the regulars to the cooks behind the counter. Sophie, ever the professional, simply nodded at him with a polite smile and guided him to a seat by the window. She didn't flinch when he glanced around with an air of superiority, his eyes scanning the humble diner like it was beneath him. "I'll have a coffee." "Black," he said curtly, not bothering to make eye contact. Sophie didn't take offense. It was part of the job. People came and went, and not everyone understood that the staff behind the counter was human too. She went to the coffee machine and began to pour his order. But as she returned, she noticed something strange: a slight look of disgust on Charles's face as he peered at the coffee. Sophie had seen it before, that slight sneer, the look people gave when they didn't think something met their high standards. "What is this?" Charles asked sharply, his tone biting. "This coffee tastes like it's been sitting for hours." Sophie, always patient, walked back over to his table and gave him a warm, practiced smile. "I'm sorry, sir. I can make a fresh pot for you right away." Charles's lips curled into a dismissive smile, but it was anything but kind. "I don't have time for that." "Just fix it," he said, his voice rising slightly, enough to make the others in the diner take notice. Sophie, without missing a beat, turned to leave, but then something inside her snapped, a quiet realization that she wasn't going to let this man walk all over her, just as she wouldn't let life walk all over her. She had been pushed around enough, her entire life bending to the will of others. She couldn't let it happen again, not today. As she turned to walk away, Charles called after her, his tone louder now. "I don't know what kind of establishment this is, but your service is absolutely atrocious. Do you know who I am?" Sophie paused for a moment, her back to him, and then slowly, she turned to face him. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on her. There was no backing down now, no retreating. This wasn't about the coffee, it was about respect. "Yes, I know exactly who you are," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You're Charles Harrington, the billionaire. But in here, you're just another customer, and you'll get the same level of respect as anyone else who walks through that door." For a moment, there was silence. Charles looked at her, his face contorting with disbelief. He was used to being feared, to people shrinking away when he spoke. He was used to having control, and here was a waitress, someone who had far less than he did, standing up to him with a strength that took him off guard. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he spat, his voice rising with anger, his posture rigid. "Do you know the kind of influence I have? The businesses I run? The people I could have removed from this place in an instant?" Sophie didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. She had faced far worse in her life, people who thought they were entitled because of their wealth, their power. She had a child at home depending on her, and she knew the value of standing up for herself, no matter the cost. "I don't care how much money you have," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "You can buy anything, but you can't buy respect. And you can't buy decency." Her words echoed in the stillness of the diner, and for the first time, Charles Harrington was speechless. His anger flickered, but there was something else in his eyes now, something that might have been admiration or maybe surprise at this woman's courage. Sophie stood there for a moment longer, her hands steady, her heart racing, but she didn't look away. After a few seconds, she turned on her heel and walked back to the counter, leaving Charles to stew in his thoughts. The rest of the diner returned to their meals, the tension breaking as if a storm had passed. Charles sat silently, no longer the imposing figure he had been when he entered, but a man unsure of what to do with a waitress who had dared to speak to him like an equal. He eventually left without a word, his coffee untouched. The staff exchanged knowing glances, a quiet respect blooming in the air. Sophie went back to her work, her shoulders a little lighter, her heart a little bolder. That night, as she lay in bed, her young son curled up beside her, she thought about the incident, about how she had stood her ground. She wasn't a billionaire. She didn't have influence or wealth. But she had something more valuable: self-respect and the courage to stand up for it, no matter who stood on the other side. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes, the strength of a single person, armed with nothing but the truth and a fierce belief in their own worth, can change everything. Lila had spent her entire life working in the quiet corner of a small diner, tucked away on the edge of the city's busiest street. A waitress for nearly a decade, she had seen the same faces day in and day out: locals coming in for their morning coffee, tired businessmen grabbing a quick lunch, and the occasional traveler passing through. But it wasn't the regulars or the big tips that mattered to her, it was the simple act of serving others with kindness and respect. Lila had learned early in life that strength didn't always come in loud, obvious gestures, but in quiet, steady perseverance. She had grown up in a broken home, raised by a single mother who had struggled to make ends meet, and she knew that real strength was found in the ability to keep going when everything seemed impossible. Lila's life was modest, yet she had a peace about her that others envied. Her presence in the diner had a way of calming even the most stressed-out customers. She had a warmth that made people feel seen, whether they were talking to her or sitting in silence. On one particularly rainy afternoon, a man entered the diner, someone Lila had never seen before. He was impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, his features sharp and calculating, with the kind of confidence that came only from immense wealth and power. His name was Nathaniel Gray, the owner of one of the largest tech companies in the world, a man known as much for his ruthless business tactics as for his impressive fortune. He sat down at the counter, glancing around with the detached air of someone who was used to being catered to. Lila approached him with her usual warmth, offering a menu and a polite smile. But Nathaniel barely acknowledged her, only responding with a curt nod. It wasn't the first time a wealthy customer had treated her as though she were invisible, but something about Nathaniel's cold demeanor lingered in her mind. She didn't take offense. Instead, she chose to do what she always did: do her job well, no matter who the customer was or how they treated her. Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel became a regular at the diner. He would come in every day, always sitting at the same spot at the counter, always ordering the same coffee and a small pastry. He never made small talk, never exchanged pleasantries, and barely acknowledged Lila's presence. Yet, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than his icy exterior suggested. She noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, the way he never seemed to let his guard down, even in the most mundane moments. One morning, as she refilled his coffee cup, Nathaniel did something unexpected. He looked up at her, his usual indifference replaced by a flicker of something that resembled frustration. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, his voice low and raw, "why people like me end up so empty?" Lila, caught off guard, paused before answering. She had never been one to offer unsolicited advice, but there was something in his voice that pulled her in. "Maybe," she said softly, "because you've spent so much time building things outside of yourself that you forgot to build what's inside." Nathaniel was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing, as if considering her words. Then, he let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh. "That's a nice way of putting it," he said, shaking his head. "I guess it's too late for me, huh?" Lila didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply refilled his coffee cup and offered him a smile, the kind that held no judgment, only a quiet understanding. It was in that moment that something shifted, not just in Nathaniel, but in Lila herself. She realized that her role in this man's life wasn't to serve him food or drinks, but to offer him something much more valuable, the quiet strength of a person who had lived through her own struggles and still managed to find peace. Over the next few months, Nathaniel's visits became more frequent, and their conversations grew deeper. He began to open up, talking about the weight of the empire he had built and the loneliness that came with it, about the relationships he had sacrificed in the pursuit of success and the hollow victories that left him more empty than fulfilled. He spoke of his family, his strained relationships, and the regret that weighed heavily on his shoulders. With each conversation, Lila listened. She never offered advice unless he asked for it, never pushed him to reveal more than he was comfortable with, but she always listened with compassion. Slowly, Nathaniel began to change. He became more introspective, more aware of the choices he had made, and the consequences those choices had on the people around him. He started to take responsibility for his actions, for the way he had treated others, especially the people who had worked for him and supported him over the years. His company, once known for its cutthroat practices, began to shift. Nathaniel started implementing policies that prioritized employee well-being, launched philanthropic initiatives, and worked to mend the broken relationships in his life. However, not everyone was pleased with his change. His sudden shift in values alienated many of his closest business partners, and his company's stock value began to plummet as investors feared that his new direction would hurt profits. The very empire Nathaniel had built started to crumble. In the midst of this downfall, Nathaniel continued to visit the diner. Each time, he looked more tired, more defeated, but Lila never judged him. She continued to offer him that same quiet strength, the kind of presence that made him feel heard without the pressure of expectations. One morning, Nathaniel arrived at the diner, his face pale and drawn. He sat at his usual spot, staring at the coffee cup in front of him, as if he had already given up. But Lila, with her simple, unwavering strength, met his gaze. "It's not about the empire," she said gently. "It's about who you are when everything else is gone." Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with something close to gratitude, but also sadness. "I don't know if I'll survive this," he said quietly. Lila smiled softly, her voice calm and steady. "You will. Because you've learned that the most important thing is not what you build, but what you become." That day, Nathaniel left the diner knowing that his life had taken a different course, one shaped not by the money he had made, but by the quiet strength of a waitress who had shown him that even in his downfall, there was a chance for redemption. And as his empire crumbled, he found something far more valuable, an understanding of himself that no amount of wealth could ever buy.